I guess we normally like start with people like introducing themselves and like their, I guess, position within the project.
That's an interesting one. RHP CDRs is a fairly substantial sort of like research unit with an evolving membership, which I'm the only permanent feature.
Oh, okay.
So there are long-term members, not necessarily members even, but there are people I work with frequently and have done for a long time.
Like regular collaborators.
Yeah, so Pete Wiseman, who was the first artist that was commissioned through RHP CDRs, we made a CD, and at the same time we did a performance to contextualise the CD. And for a lot of the people we work with, that's where the relationship might end. But then there are people that... So Pete's a personally very good friend. So it's easier for that relationship to carry on. So he's maybe done 10 performances for RHP CDRs now.
Okay.
And when his self-released another CD, that was a little supported by RHP CDRs, although it wasn't an RHP CDRs project.
No, sure.
So yeah, although I'm this like fixed point in the project, there are people that regularly come and go.
Yeah.
There are people that might just come temporarily and then go very quickly.
Yeah, sure. Well, that's interesting. There was something on your site that I found interesting in terms of, I think you called it that, like RHP transcripts.
Mm-hmm.
This idea of this like wider collection of conversations that happens around the projects. One instance being, so if you're like, as you're friends with Pete, that you're that conversation will continue, like in the pub or over dinner or whatever. It's like it has a natural like life to it.
Equally, people I don't know personally become really good friends through this process.
Yeah.
So Kaal, who runs Space Canvas Experiment, it's like a Malaysian sonic arts project. I don't quite know how he would define it, but I first discovered their work 2009, like long before RHP CDRs had even began to formulate. He sent me over a copy of his album. We kept talking every few months.
Sure.
And then eventually when RHP CDRs had become an entity, and I was in the position to say, have you got some work? We made a project.
Oh, nice.
And this is like, it's an ongoing relationship, so tomorrow as part of the Jeremy Della Bus Tour project, we're going to be showing some of their documentation of performances.
Okay.
As like a video screening, which has been the great thing about the project. It's effectively it is about these relationships.
Yeah, that's interesting. Because I noticed there's a few, like venues or sort of spaces that you've worked with continuously.
Yeah, there've been some very great supporters actually. Allthorpe Studios and Gallery, which is a charity based in Leamington Spa. When they opened, they had this fantastic sort of set of studios in a gallery space. But at the time, it wasn't really a gallery space; it was just a big room.
Okay.
And they were thinking about doing shows, and I was looking for some spaces, so I offered to come along and help out, do the space up a bit.
Sure.
And do some maintenance now and again after that. And yeah, they've been fantastic. So they hosted my festival in December and didn't charge me for 10 days use of the space. So there are these great relationships with different organisations, like around the West Midlands.
Yeah. I guess that's another like we've spoken a little bit about like Birmingham as like a place there seems like there's a lot happening now.
Mm-hmm.
There's like a vibrant scene.
There is, yeah.
I guess I wondered about like what your perception of like community within that was, and like in terms of, I guess maybe in terms of just like mutual support between spaces and projects.
I sort of have a funny position because I'm very much part of that community, but I do so much work elsewhere that I'm maybe not as involved in Birmingham as a lot of people are.
Sure.
I mean, there are spaces here I've done projects with, so I've worked with Strix, which is a fantastic space, 10-minute walk from here. I've worked with Musfac and Friction Arts a lot. They're a 10-minute walk from here in the opposite direction. And that's the great thing, these spaces are so close geographically to each other that sort of collaboration is really possible.
Yeah, sure.
But at the same time, I'm interested in Coventry is only 20 minutes away, and Warsaw's only 20 minutes away in the opposite direction on the train. So we've got this this network of cities with their own sort of ecologies that are really close, and with some development, those relationships could become really strong and useful.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess I was interested about like the origins of RHP CDRs, because it's an interesting like premise, researching this, like the connection between, I guess, contemporary art and like experimental noise. The two worlds seem to sort of like flow a little bit in and out of each other at times.
Yeah.
But those connections are very rarely like explicitly made.
I'm quite interested in these like intersection points. So I really like where art and design meet, or music and architecture, which is very rare. But with RHP CDRs particularly, it was effectively as a fan.
Sure.
So I buy a lot of CDs and records and cassettes and floppy disks because that's what I like. And then I began, I am a contemporary artist, curator, and then I began to notice there are these moments that weren't being documented or explored in any particular way, but that were definitely there. So I set out to explore those connections, not quite knowing what RHP CDRs is or would be. And it was just maybe 6 months ago that, so the project's been going for a year and a half, pushing 2 years. It was about 6 months ago that I realised this is a body of research. I am a research unit in that, although I'm on my own, I work with a lot of people. And so I began to formalise what it is and how things happen.
That's a kind of, I guess, a sort of an often or difficult maybe to make that transparent to people, that like, you know, the personal kind of body of research that you accumulate from doing a project, which I guess is where like the RHP transfers potentially comes in.
Yeah, just sort of looking through my inbox, I realised there's like a wealth of material with people that, for whatever reason, it is impossible to make a project with, but the work is still fantastic. So with very sort of minimal editing, like these discussions could potentially be useful. I maybe don't know who for or in what context, but I mean, blogging's a fantastic way of making it available.
Absolutely.
And I think most people with any kind of curatorial practice have this. I mean, they must, because the job is about talking to people. So, and making sense of things. So just because something hasn't resolved itself doesn't mean it doesn't make sense in some way.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess I was interested as well in terms of like the fact that you aim the project specifically at like making visible auditory aspects of people's practice who aren't necessarily like music producers solely. That's a kind of tangential aspect to their practice.
Well, I guess it comes back to this interest in where things meet.
Sure.
So also it's to expose ways of thinking maybe. So there's several people that I've released work by who consider themselves to be sculptors. But I've been to gigs where they've been reading poetry and they don't consider that part of their practice.
Yeah.
But it very much is. It's that same mindset.
Yeah.
And it's an incredibly similar way of working.
Yeah.
With quite similar outcomes. So
just a different medium.
yeah, and it's interesting that people maybe don't consider these things they're doing to be part of a wider thing.
Sure.
So an example is Andy Hopkins, who was the third person we released work by, I think.
Yeah.
Fantastic sculptor and painter, and his work, his visual artwork, for want of a better terminology, is very much about sort of documenting this fantastical world that I'm not sure if he's created it or experiences it, but it's this interesting place. And then I saw some videos that he just made in the studio that weren't particularly resolved. It's just him repeating phrases or like speaking aloud.
Oh, sure.
So yeah, these spring to mind because I'm actually showing them again as part of Jeremy Deller's event tomorrow.
Yeah.
So, but also visiting the studio, there's like a guitar and an old synthesizer, and then I've seen him just sat in the studio like tinkling, and it's like these very odd sounds you're making with like a child's glockenspiel are completely part of this world that is your body of work. And so he recorded 57 very short tracks of this sort of tinkling that became his release.
Oh, nice.
And that came with a book of poetry that he'd written as well. And I feel like for me it's a great way of approaching his practice as a painter and sculptor and whatever else. It's almost like a caption for a piece of his work.
Yeah. So it's almost kind of like a quite classical curatorial role that you take with the project in terms of like holding things up to the light and being kind of like, does this work in this context?
Yeah, sure. And that phrase curator is quite interesting itself. I mean, I hold a collection. RHP CDRs has a large collection of not just artworks and objects by the practitioners we work with, but like reference material and like contextual material, which maybe doesn't always present itself to audiences, but again it helps me work through these questions about how does something present itself. So Elizabeth Fowden we worked with in January. Was really interested in, I'm not going to get the name right, St. Hildegard of Bingen. It was a 12th or 13th century German nun who experienced really intense visions. And Elizabeth had made a series of drone works. It was about 3 and a bit hours long in total, about these visions and distortions of vision. We were thinking about how does this get presented in a way that it actually makes sense to refer back to the Hildegard of Bingen. So we presented it in a church and it became like a really meditative experience. which I don't think perhaps she was thinking about for the work.
No.
But as a curatorial standpoint, it made complete sense.
Yeah. In terms of like joining the dots with it.
And I think for audiences as well, I mean, the drone work had maybe no cement fixture point to the reference material. So just by the architectural surroundings helped add that layer of context.
Yeah.
But quite excitingly, as a result of people coming along to that event, that church is now hosting experimental music nights.
Oh, really?
Which is an amazing thing.
Yeah.
Partially because it's very close to my house, and I can go and enjoy these evenings. But also in that, yeah, it's fantastic for that sort of scene to recontextualise itself, maybe. Well, I think this is the thing. There's a lot of the work by people I'm working with that is maybe quite abstract in several senses of the word.
Yeah.
I think it's interesting to find ways into that,
Yeah.
which as an art audience we're completely used to doing with painting or with sculpture or installation or whatever other medium. But maybe sound is just beginning to have that kind of relationship with audiences.
Yeah, sure. On the other side of it, I guess I was interested in terms of like your relationship with the experimental music scene.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of like, do you find you have much kind of like dialogue between the two kind of scenes, for want of a better word?
Yeah, but not really through me trying to develop that.
Sure.
So the sort of DIY experimental music scene is fantastically productive and very well connected. So these guys have just approached me at various points.
Oh, okay. In terms of like just being interested in what you're doing.
Yeah, so if guys are going on tour, maybe once a month or twice a month I'll get an email saying, we're passing through the West Midlands, can you put on a gig?
Amazing.
Which, yes, it's a fantastic thing, and if I can facilitate it, I will. More often than not, I sort of can't.
Yeah.
But, so yeah, there are these connections.
And that's happened just quite naturally.
Yeah. And as a fan of that kind of work, it's been great for me because people that I've maybe followed their work for several years have contacted me and said, I'm coming to England, I want a gig.
Yeah.
It's like, oh brilliant, I hadn't thought to contact you because whatever reason.
Yeah.
So I get to know people that I've admired maybe,
Yeah.
which is great.
Absolutely.
One thing that has been interesting is how do I work with scenes outside of contemporary art within a contemporary art setting.
Yeah.
So obviously musicians that have been trained through music school have a very different way of working to people that have gone through art school. So it's a similar experience in that it's very sort of you have to be aware of what you're doing and the context that surrounds that. But in terms of industries, they're very different things. So a lot of young artists are quite prepared to have work in a show for no money. But young musicians, no way. Like musicians want paying. That's their work. So that's an interesting thing. I think artists obviously need to start picking up on these ways of working. But also there are musicians that are sort of demanding sums of money that they maybe don't warrant yet. It's not to say they won't. So it is interesting to be having these conversations with these two groups of people and trying to find maybe not a middle ground, because that's just settling for making nobody happy, but finding situations which are fair and beneficial for both parties.
That brings me on to I guess my another point, which like I'm always interested in finding out how their projects survive financially in terms of like funding or sales, and also like how much money personally people put into their projects.
I'm very lucky at the minute that RHP CDRs is self-supporting. The first 8 or 9 months of the project, it was completely self-funded to the point where there were days I didn't eat, which I think is probably a fairly common experience with people starting a project. But yeah, that hard work seems to be paying off. RHP CDRs has its own bank account, and it's fairly stable.
Is that from sales?
It's come from a variety of things. So we do sell a lot of CDs. We have pockets of funding from local authorities, Coventry City Council, supported projects, Warwick District Council, who we spoke about earlier, have both given funding for projects. And I try to use that funding in such a way where it will become supportive for a longer period of time.
Sure.
So buying a PA system for a particular project with funding is obviously beneficial in that I now have a PA system. And that will
never have to hire one. Sure.
So I think where I have got funding, I've tried to be very sensible with it.
That's interesting.
And also commissions. So when I worked with BRG for the Sluice Art Fair, they paid for the production of a body of work. Likewise, Coventry Art Space, who I'm working with tomorrow for the Jeremy Della Bus Tour, paid for the work. So there are ways of making the project survive and to keep the bank account balanced, which are possible with careful management.
Do you think it's helped to have like a commercial aspect to the project in terms of like having products that you can sell?
Yeah, it certainly has. I mean, the first few editions we released, I was printing on a domestic printer at home, which is obviously hugely labour intensive and cost intensive. But through working through these ways of working, I've managed to get costs down, which means there's more income, which means I can pay artists better and the project is more stable. But that's just trial and error. But yes, certainly selling CDs is useful.
How do you mind me asking like how you kind of divide the profit between like the project and artists involved?
Yeah, that's fine. It's sort of it's evolved. So when I first started, I set out to pay artists 75% of profit, which never was a huge amount. CDs sell for like 7-8 quid. So I was going to get them maybe 4-5 quid a time. But then as the project has sort of grown or changed, whatever it's done, as it's carried on, I've maybe commissioned artists with a lump sum for a body of work, as opposed to paying them profit from sales, or just negotiated certain things. So obviously artists get copies of their CD. Some artists have been happy to take more copies for no profit.
Because they can then sell
them themselves or distribute them however they see fit.
So you're doing performance lecture?
Yeah, well, I've done a few. doing another one tomorrow. The first couple were developed during a residency where I was thinking about ways of physically platforming.
Sure.
So the performance lecture, which it was a DJ set that I spoke over, was a way of platforming works that I've commissioned.
Okay.
The one I'm doing tomorrow is slightly different in that it is beginning to pick apart these areas of research. So it's going to be a DJ set that I talk over that's scheduled to be 2 hours long. And I am beginning to look at what the artists are doing within the projects. So there's a group of artists I've worked with that are working with field recordings.
Okay.
And interjecting something into a field recording. So there'll be a section of the performance lecture on that group.
Yeah.
Likewise, there are a group of artists that work with improvisation. So there'll be an area of the performance lecture about that. And then I'm beginning to look at how these things connect to each other.
Oh, interesting.
So yeah, I think the research unit tag, like the project itself, is something that is developing.
Yeah.
And I'm still in that stage where I'm working out what it is.
Yeah.
Things have become more cement than they were.
Yeah.
Some haven't, and that's fine.
Yeah, of course.
Well, it's just this case of what the gallery space is. It's like critical theory or curatorial theory tells us it's this quiet space to contemplate an object. And sound art is an instant disruption of that. Which is something a lot of sound artists have pushed by making really abrasive noise. Amplified incredibly loud. Which, potentially does completely ruin like a painter's practice. So it's just...
Well, or even potentially the fabric of the building.
Yeah. So it's interesting how these things can exist together or not.
Yeah, no, completely. But it sounds like a really, productive thing to explore, though.
Mm-hmm.
Precisely that kind of, I really like the image. Well, I guess it makes me think immediately of that Mark Lecky piece he did with, I think it's with the Kids, or not Rodin's The Kids. I can't remember the other. Another version of The Kids.
Okay.
Where it's just basically you've got this standoff between a wall of speakers and this stone sculpture.
Yeah, wow. I haven't seen it.
It's really nice. It's kind of,
I'm going to hunt it down.
yeah. It's quite a fun, and he talks about it being this kind of like weird conversation. Where it ends up being kind of like the silent party is there, so it's just like one person shouting. But this, it's interesting precisely for that tension.
Yeah, sure.
What about, do you have, where would you like to take the project in terms of, do you have like a direction that you'd like to take it in the future?
There are things I would like to happen.
Sure.
I don't know if they necessarily will or even should.
Yeah, okay.
A question I'm really, really commonly asked. I'm currently being interviewed for a magazine. They asked me this question yesterday. Have you ever considered having a project space for RHP?
Sure.
So, of course I have, but like we've already discussed, what would that space be?
Yeah.
I have thought briefly about having a project space on board a narrowboat.
Okay.
As a way for the work's so embedded with movement, it would seem a bit ridiculous to have a project space that's in a fixed point. And being based in the West Midlands, the canals are a huge geographical feature. So for a few months, not a very long time, I've been thinking about this idea of a project space on a narrow boat.
Yeah, nice.
But I haven't been thinking about it long enough to work out if that's a good idea or not.
Even viable.
Yeah, like how possible, like actually is that to logistically do? So yeah, there are things I'd like to do, but I've got the next sort of like 9 months of programming sort of more or less in place.
Yeah, sure. I saw there was a huge list of like upcoming releases.
Yeah. And there are releases that are already like printed, discs burnt, just sat in the studio. Like, so there's pieces that are ready to go. And then there are pieces where I've commissioned the work and it's just not made yet. So yeah, there are a lot of things due to happen, planned to happen, but thinking much further ahead doesn't have, well, I'm sort of busy enough that thinking 4 years ahead just isn't possible.
Yeah, sure.
As much as I'd maybe like to.
Yeah.
It's just, I don't like to release the thing without having a way to release it. I mean, I could just pop it onto the Bandcamp page tomorrow, I could do it this afternoon.
Yeah.
But there's no need to do that. The work's not going anywhere. When we can do a project, like a wider project that contextualises it, is public facing, it just makes much more sense to do them. We've done album launches that have lasted 4 days, 5 days. So, like, given the way people I work with are making work, like an exhibition has been an album launch.
Sure.
Which is something you don't normally get within the commercial music industry.
Absolutely.
But so there are distinctions, but yeah, there are these connections.
Yeah.